Let's get started here. And now more than ever, speed matters. Decisions have to be quick, companies flexible and nimble. And the workforces need not only to have the right technology, but the skills to employ that technology optimally. If anything, these events of this year have taught us, it is that employees need to be able to pivot and do so quickly. And that's one of the great lessons, I think, of 2020. Here to discuss how to hire and reskill the right way are Deanna Mulligan. She is Guardian Life Insurance's board chair and author of a new book, Higher Purpose, and Lee Henderson, EY America's private leader and a specialist on the middle market. Leading the conversation is my friend, CNBC's Kate Rogers. Kate, it's yours.
Tyler, thank you so much. And Deanna and Lee, thank you so much for joining us here today for this important conversation. And as Tyler mentioned, we would love to hear from you in the audience, so please do submit those questions for our experts in the chat. Lee, I'll start with you. Tyler mentioned that so many companies had to pivot really quickly this year. Doing that at a middle market company is a little more challenging than it would be at a small business with just 5 or 10 employees, but it's also a little easier than doing it at a really large company. What's your best advice for taking on that pivot? Where should a middle market company start?
Well, Kate, first of all, thanks for being here. And yeah, I've been speaking to a lot of business leaders over the last 6 months and really have sort of been talking to them through some of the things that they've been challenged with. And one of the things that I've seen and heard and seen heard from business leaders is companies right now have to and have been managing their businesses at a level of rigor and discipline. It's so detailed than we've ever seen in the past, unprecedented. And they're doing all this with less resources, right? And the advice I would give those that are listening in, and what I've seen from some of those that have been successful, at least through this pandemic so far, is they've had to be vigilant about every hour and every dollar spent. And it goes a little bit deeper than this. It's about timing of cash conversion and thinking about your cash conversion cycle. Now, we've always talked about earnings in the past with companies, and that still continues to be really relevant and important. But cash conversion, even though it's been a concept and that existed in business for time, it's never been more important. The example I would give is inventory. When you buy inventory today and you pay, let's say you pay for inventory today, to focus on when the cash from the sale of that inventory hits your bank account is critical. And I think every middle market, and this goes for the service industry as well, that's just an example, but every middle market business right now should be really asking themselves, for every dollar spent, not just what is the return, but when is the return?
That's a great point. Thank you for making that. And Deanna, I'll turn to you now. One really important thing that you've mentioned and you talk about in your new book, Higher Purpose, is developing a learning culture within the company. That's from the top down. How does a middle market company start down that path in creating a learning culture for executives and employees? Sorry about that. I think we might be having a technical issue. Deanna may be muted. So Leah, I'm going to turn that question over to you about creating learning cultures within your organization. Any tips for companies in the audience who are looking to go down that path with their employees?
Yeah, I think, well, I'll give you a little bit of my view. I think the human capital piece, and I'll answer your question directly in a bit, Kate, but I think the human capital portion of this equation overall is, in my view, one of the most important things that companies should be focused on right now. And as I speak to business leaders, the need to sort of upskill and change a skill and look at what's needed for the future is really important. I think I don't think any of us have seen employees in our workforce under so much stress, anxiety, and insecurity right now. No one's seen this in the past. We're dealing with so many challenges right now in the workforce and our people and our families, politics, natural disasters, social justice issues, and the pandemic on top of that. which has led to a disastrous level of workforce reduction in a short period of time. So, I mean, if I look at my teams, for example, you've got young professionals sharing apartments with multiple roommates. You have working parents with young kids, pretty much homeschooling, and people are really challenging the level of productivity. Business leaders are saying, are my employees productive enough? But I really feel that one of the things I've seen and heard from business leaders as it relates to their workforce is really asking the question are you okay? Are we reaching out to our workforce and saying, are you okay from a mental health standpoint? And do you have the tools? Are we providing as business leaders the tools to really help you be as productive as you possibly can? With respect to the changing of the workforce, as companies begin to transform, we hear the term transformation quite a bit. I hear the term as well, Kate, weathering the storm. And you hear that consistently, that we're weathering the storm right now. And that phrase actually troubles me a bit, because what it really implies is that we're waiting for something to pass, and then we're going to go back to 2019 magically, or something that we all are familiar with. But I really feel that what I've heard from business leaders is they're really starting to sit around the table with the right advisors and think about, well, what do we need to plan for? And as we think about what the future holds and what the new normal is, that's when we have to start thinking about, okay, how do we really upskill our workforce, or how do we change our workforce to make sure that we are prepared to for what's to come?
I think that's such a great point that you just made. We cannot go back to 2019. We are in an entirely new environment. All of the learnings that we've gained, throughout this process, for better or for worse, need to stick with these companies. You touched on upskilling. That's something we started to hear when the labor market was really tight before the pandemic hit. So many companies started really investing in their current workforces because, quite frankly, workers had their choice of opportunities, right? And companies really wanted to hang on to them. How should they be thinking about upskilling and reskilling their workforces now in this new era?
That's for me, Kate. How should you? Well, I think the first thing is companies have to be able to really think about flex and transform. So I feel first you got to answer the question. And what I hear, we have. I think you're where we have our strategic growth forum that's coming up later or next month. And so I've been talking to a lot of business leaders about this. And one of the things that you have to really address first is companies are asking the question is, who are our customers, right? Because you have to answer that question first. Who are our customers going to be? Who are our suppliers? I mean, I hear business leaders asking, are we even in the right business, right? So you sit around a table and you start to figure out those things. Are we in the right business, and so on and so on? What that's leading to is you're starting to see activity pick up in the market, in the transaction market. So companies are starting to sell off some of their non-core assets as a result. They're starting to, on the other side, you see companies having opportunistic acquisitions as a result. There's a lot of partnerships being formed, alliances being formed, and companies sort of coming together to really figure out what are we going to be for the future. Once you figure that out, Kate, then you can start to say, okay, well, what do we need, right? I think we can talk about digital transformation later, and I heard the term digital transformation. But once you figure that out, I think that is the bedrock of what has to be addressed before you start to think about, okay, well, who do we need? What do we need? And what investments do we need to make? So I think the upskilling part and looking at what the workforce needs to be is really important. But before you go there, you really got to take a really hard look with a blank sheet of paper of what you are, what business you're in, and how do you prepare in a time that's incredibly uncertain, which is the big challenge.
Absolutely a challenge. And I do want to let the audience know we are working on Deanna's audio, and we very much hope that she can come back soon. But Lee, I'm going to continue this conversation with you for the time being here. You mentioned checking in with employees, asking if they're okay. I think that that's also a really important piece outside of just upskilling and making sure that they are able to pivot, take on new challenges, and gain new skills and stick with the company. Company culture and values really matter. How do you keep them in place as the company continues to grow? That's something that middle market companies, I would imagine, do struggle with, right? It's really easy at a tiny business to say these are our values and all 5 of us will stick to them. But as you grow and succeed and get larger, which we hope happens to all the businesses who are watching, how do you hang on to that company culture and really instill those values and let people know you care about them?
Kate, that is such a question, such a great question, and it's really the question I feel that every single person from middle market to startup to large companies, one is struggling with, but also needs to really ask themselves. And again, I'll share with you my perspective based on what I've seen and heard, both from us at EY, as well as a lot of the business leaders I've spoken to. I would say one thing that gets overlooked, Kate, is how do we communicate? How do we as business leaders communicate with our internal stakeholders, right? We talk about our customers, we talk about our suppliers, we talk about our analysts, our investors, and so on. But taking a really hard look at your employees internally and addressing the question about culture. So the first thing is, how do we communicate? Social media has taken over our communication right now, and it's really hurting. It's really hurting us. It's really hurting employee morale. It's really disrupting loyalty. It's really disrupting productivity. So as business leaders, you've got to sit back and think about who do we want to control the narrative for us? Do we want social media to control the narrative, or do we want internal to control the narrative? So I would suggest, right, based on what I've seen, is that companies come up with their communication plan that's going to be transparent and consistent. I understand that you can't share everything with employees, but it's really important to have a communication plan for your internal stakeholders, to where when key business decisions are going to be made, when reduction in the workforce, when change of workforce, when results are not right, that you have a plan in place to communicate with your own people first, to make sure that once it hits social media, you've already kind of controlled the narrative and you don't create this level of anxiety and stress in your people, which really backfires and creates, again, disloyal employees, anxiety, which again just leads to a lack of productivity.
That's a great point, Lee. And Deanna, thank you so much for sticking by. We apologize to you and to the audience about the technology issues in our new work from home era. So thanks you everyone for being patient here. Deanna, I'll go back to that question that I posed to you. And I mentioned that you talk about this issue in your new book, Higher Purpose. I would love for you to talk about learning cultures at companies, instilling them. Lee mentioned quite a bit adhering to values and kind of keeping those in place as you grow at a company. But I know you care deeply about learning cultures at companies and establishing them from the top down. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
Yes, great. Thank you. And I would say I have 3 tips for establishing a learning culture at a company. First of all, as we've been discussing, it needs to start from the top. So as the CEO, as the leadership team, you need to be able to take on new things and fail and let people see you do that, because the learning culture is really about innovation, evolution. So first of all, it has to start at the top. Second, I would say start small. Pick a problem that everyone can relate to, get around the table, get some outside assistance if you need it. Start small, solve a problem, get the team focused on learning. And 3, never forget about the learning culture. So we have days called Leader Learning Days and Leader Learning Events, where we do little half-an-hour sessions over lunch, brown bag lunch. You can do those online. Get people to let people know it's important for you to have a learning in your organization.
And you mentioned leadership learning and higher up executives at companies and the importance of them continuing that learning journey. Can you elaborate a bit more on why that's important? I'd imagine that setting an example for your workforce is really key here and letting them know that you are also invested in continuing your learning journey. But if you can talk a bit about that, we'd appreciate it.
Yes. When we have leader learning days once a year, we take all leaders offline for a day, and my executive team spread out across the entire country and went to host in different back offices and offices around the country and around the world, actually, days when leaders set aside to think about their careers, think about the future of Guardian, think about the skills we need, and think about how we can connect those things. So I think showing that you are taking time out of your schedule, you're having conversations with middle and lower management and frontline employees to see what they need, see what innovation opportunities there are, and really then following up, supporting those is really important.
With just a few minutes left, I'd love to ask you both what you foresee as the biggest headwind for middle market companies moving ahead in this new environment. Not that any of us have a crystal ball, but I'd love your take on what you foresee as the biggest challenge moving ahead and what you give as your best piece of advice to companies in evaluating those challenges, potentially pivoting, hanging on to the learnings from this year and moving ahead? Lee, I'm going to ask you that one first, and Deanna will come to you too.
Well, I'm going to take two, because I always say cash right now is whatever you've got to do to think about cash and really just get micro-focused on cash. But the other thing, in no particular order, is I go back to Kate, the question and what this segment is about is really people, is focusing on your people and not assume that we have too many people, we don't have the right people, but perhaps there's the right skill doesn't exist, as Deanna and Kate, as you mentioned, the right skill doesn't exist. So helping work through with your current workforce, one is, what are their needs to help them right now, because they need help as well. And then in turn is, what skills do you need for the future, and being very open with them and communicate with them, because a lot of those people are really, really bright, sharp people who can be upskilled. They're not even upskilled, but change of skill to help, change with the company and with your strategy. So I just say is really, really focus on our people right now, because they need it. And as business leaders, we need it as well.
That's a great answer. And Deanna, I'll pose that one to you. Biggest challenge or headwind for these middle market companies moving ahead, and how you'd evaluate the challenge, hang on to the learnings from this year, and what advice you'd give moving ahead.
Well, Lee said cash, and I think that's a great one. I'm going to say customer. We're sticking with the 3 C's here. I think we need to get customers back to the table, right? And in order to do that, we need to all cooperate. So how do we collectively get middle market companies back and get customers back? We need to collaborate to get rid of this pandemic, right? We need to get scientists working together and get this over with so customers will come back. We need to prioritize inclusiveness and diversity. We need to get everyone around the table and make sure everyone has a voice in brainstorming how we solve some of these middle market problems. And then finally, we need to reskill, retrain, and as we were just talking about, develop a learning culture.
Great advice from you both, Deanna Mulligan, Lee Henderson. We so appreciate your time and your insights for our audience. Thank you both for being here, and thank you everyone for watching.